Otsana thought her life was worth nothing. Her uncle confirmed it when he traded her for a stack of cash and a cleared debt. But the man who bought her was no farmer. He was Hrolf Gonzalo, a creature of nightmare and shadow, a king among wolves. She expected chains. She found a crown she never asked for. She expected death. She found a destiny written in blood and moonlight. In a world where claws rule and mercy is a weakness, Otsana must learn that the only thing more dangerous than the beast sleeping in her bed is the love growing in her heart. She wasn't just sold. She was fated. The neon open sign of the diner sputtered and died, plunging the sidewalk into a gloom that matched the ache in Otsana's bones. It was the end of a double shift, the kind that left her feet throbbing in rhythm with her heartbeat and her skin coated in a film of fryer grease that the rain couldn't wash away. She huddled into her coat, a thin wool thing that had lost its warmth 2 winters ago, and stepped out into the biting October wind. Her hand instinctively went to her pocket, fingers brushing against the meager cluster of crumpled bills and coins. $24. It was a pathetic sum to show for 14 hours of being screamed at for cold coffee and undercooked eggs, but she did the mental math anyway. If she walked home instead of taking the bus, and if she skipped lunch for the rest of the week, she might have enough to keep the electricity on for 3 more days. The walk to the tenement district was a trudge through the city's gray veins. Otsana kept her head down, navigating the cracked pavement by memory, avoiding the puddles that looked deep enough to swallow her whole. This was her life, a tightrope walk over a pit of poverty, balancing the needs of survival against the crushing weight of her uncle's addiction. She reached her building, a decaying monolith of peeling paint and rusted fire escapes, and pushed through the heavy front door. The lobby smelled of mildew and boiled cabbage, a scent that usually comforted her in a twisted way. It smelled like home. But as she climbed the 4 flights of stairs, the elevator out of order as always, a knot of dread began to tighten in her stomach. It wasn't a sound that warned her, but a feeling. The air on the 4th floor landing felt charged, pressurized. When she reached apartment 4B, she stopped cold. The door was unlocked. A sliver of golden light spilled onto the dirty hallway runner, cutting through the shadows like a warning blade. Farkas never unlocked the door. His paranoia, fueled by debts he couldn't pay, and men he shouldn't have borrowed from, kept him behind 3 deadbolts day and night. Otsana pushed the door open with a trembling hand. The smell hit her instantly, not the usual stale odor of cheap whiskey and old takeout, but something sharp, metallic, and terrifyingly expensive. It smelled like pine, musk, and old money. Farkas was sitting at the scratched laminate kitchen table, but he wasn't the blustering, chaotic mess she was used to dealing with. He was small, hunched over his glass of amber liquid as if trying to disappear into it. His hands shook so violently that the ice chimed against the glass. Across from him sat a man who sucked all the oxygen out of the room. He wore a charcoal suit tailored to a precision that screamed power, his legs crossed casually, a leather briefcase resting by his polished shoes. He didn't look like he belonged in a walk-up apartment. He looked like he belonged in a boardroom or a mausoleum. "Otsana," Farkas croaked, his voice cracking. He refused to look at her, his eyes fixed on the condensation ringing his glass. You're home early." "Who is this, Farkas?" Otsana stepped into the room, the door clicking shut behind her. She kept her back to it, a subconscious desire to keep an escape route open. The stranger answered before her uncle could. "I am the solution, Miss Vancroft," he said. His voice was dry and smooth, like sand sliding over stone. He didn't stand up. He simply turned his head, his eyes dark and flat, assessing her with a chilling indifference. "My name is Hemming. Your uncle and I were just discussing the untenable nature of his ledger. Hemming tapped a manicured finger on a thick, cream-colored document lying on the table. The paper looked heavy, the black ink stark and final. The debts have matured. The interest has compounded beyond his ability to pay. We are past the point of extensions or payment plans. Otsana felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold. She looked at Farkas, willing him to say something, to fight, to be the guardian he was supposed to be. But he just took a shuddering gulp of whiskey, wiping his mouth with a shaking hand. I tried, Otsana, he mumbled to the table. I tried to win it back. A sure thing at the tracks. It went wrong. How much? Otsana interrupted, her voice shrill. She stepped forward, placing herself between the stranger and her uncle. I can get another job. I can ask for an advance. We can pay you. Hemming let out a short, sharp laugh that lacked any humor. Money is no longer the currency we require, he said, standing up. He was taller than he looked sitting down, looming over the cramped kitchen. Mr. Thorne, the principal holder of your uncle's debt, requires something more tangible. He requires labor, service, loyalty. He picked up the document and held it out. Otsana's eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, her breath catching in her throat as the words swam before her. Transfer of guardianship, indenture of service, collateral liquidation. What is this? She whispered. It's a job, Otsana, Farkas said quickly, too quickly. He finally looked at her, his eyes wet and pleading. Up north, in the mountains, Mr. Thorne, he has a farm, a big estate. He needs staff, live-in staff. You go there, you work for him, and the debt is gone. All of it. I'll be clear. We'll be clear. Otsana looked from her uncle to the cold, impassive face of Hemming. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. You didn't find me a job, she said, her voice trembling. You sold me. I saved us. Farkas slammed his hand on the table, the glass jumping. They were going to kill me, Otsana. They were going to break my legs and leave me in the alley. It's just work. You're strong. You're used to work. It's better than the diner. It is an indefinite contract, Hemming corrected clinically. You will belong to the Thorne estate until the principal decides the value has been recouped. You will have no contact with the outside world. You will have no wages. You are the payment. Otsana backed away, shaking her head. No, I won't go. You can't do this. Hemming didn't lunge. He didn't shout. He simply reached into his jacket and placed a heavy black pistol on the table next to the contract. The sound of the metal hitting the wood was a dull thud that silenced the room. The contract is signed, Miss Vancroft, Hemming said softly. The transaction is complete. If the collateral, that is you, refuses to be transported, the contract is voided. And if the contract is voided, I am authorized to collect the debt from your uncle's flesh. Right here. Right now. The silence that followed was suffocating. Otsana looked at Farkas. He was weeping now, silent, pathetic sobs, curling in on himself. He was a man broken by his own vices, and he was offering her up as a sacrifice to buy himself another day of misery. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a hollow, icy numbness. She realized then that she had no family. She was alone. Fine, she whispered, the word tasting like ash. Fine. Excellent, Hemming said, checking his gold watch. You have nothing to pack that Mr. Thorne cannot provide. The transport is waiting. He placed a hand on the small of her back, a possessive, guiding touch that made her skin crawl, and steered her toward the door. Otsana didn't look back at the kitchen, didn't look back at the uncle who was already reaching for the bottle to drown his guilt. They walked down the stairs in silence, the descent feeling like a funeral procession. When they emerged onto the street, the rain had turned into a deluge. A massive black SUV sat idling at the curb, its engine purring with a deep, predatory rumble that vibrated in her chest. The windows were tinted so dark they looked like voids, swallowing the streetlights. The driver got out to open the rear door. He was huge, his neck as thick as a tree trunk, his movements possessing a fluid, dangerous grace that unnerved her. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her scent, inhaling deeply as she passed, his eyes flashing with something feral in the dark. Hemming nudged her forward. "Be a good investment, Miss Vancroft," he murmured. Otsana climbed into the leather interior. It smelled of sterile air and new car, a hermetically sealed capsule designed to transport her from one hell to another. The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off the sound of the rain in the city. As the lock engaged with a sharp metallic click, Otsana watched the tenement building disappear through the rain-streaked glass, realizing she wasn't just leaving home. She was being driven off the edge of the known world. The drive was a blur of asphalt and silence, stretching hours into the night until the city lights were nothing but a distant, hazy memory in the rearview mirror. Otsana sat rigid in the back of the SUV, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned white. The driver never spoke, never turned on the radio, and never adjusted the rearview mirror to look at her. He simply drove with a terrifying, mechanical precision, guiding the heavy vehicle off the highway and onto a winding mountain road that narrowed with every mile. The landscape changed. The scrubby bushes and billboards of the suburbs gave way to ancient, towering pines that crowded the road, their branches interlocking overhead to blot out the moon. It felt less like they were driving to a farm and more like they were descending into the throat of the earth. Suddenly, the vehicle slowed. Ahead, illuminated by the harsh white beams of the headlights, a massive gate loomed out of the darkness. It wasn't the wooden gate of a rustic homestead. It was 12 feet of reinforced steel, topped with razor wire and flanked by cameras that swiveled with predatory jerky movements to track their approach. The driver lowered his window, extending a thick arm to swipe a keycard against a panel. The gate groaned open, the sound echoing through the silent forest like a dying beast. As they passed through, Otsana pressed her face against the cold glass. The farm was a lie. She saw no barns, no tractors, no fields of corn. Instead, she saw shadows moving in the tree line, massive shapes that paced alongside the car with unnatural speed, their eyes reflecting the headlights in flashes of luminescent amber. She shivered, pulling away from the window. The estate house emerged from the gloom, a sprawling fortress of gray stone and dark timber that looked as if it had grown out of the mountain itself. It was beautiful in a severe Gothic way, but it felt cold. The SUV pulled up to the front steps, and the driver killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. The door lock clicked open. "Out!" the driver rumbled. It was the first word he had spoken in 4 hours. Otsana scrambled out, clutching her duffel bag to her chest. The air here was thin and sharp, biting at her exposed skin. Before she could get her bearings, the massive oak front door swung open. A woman stood there, framed by the warm, yellow light of the foyer. She was older, perhaps in her 60s, with steel-gray hair pulled back into a severe bun and a posture as rigid as a soldier's. She wore a crisp black dress that looked like a uniform from a different century. "You are late," the woman said. Her voice wasn't unkind, but it brooked no argument. She stepped aside, gesturing for Otsana to enter. "I am Cathwolf. I manage the household. Wipe your feet. We do not track mud into the Alphas, into Mr. Thorne's home." Otsana obeyed, wiping her worn sneakers on the mat. The foyer was cavernous, with vaulted ceilings and a grand staircase that curved upward into the shadows. The floor was polished obsidian, reflecting the chandelier above like a dark pool. "Mr. Hemming said you are to work off a substantial debt," Cathwolf said, looking Otsana up and down with eyes that seemed to count her ribs and measure her pulse. "You will start in the scullery and housekeeping. We are short-staffed. The men eat a lot, and they are messy." "The men?" Otsana asked, her voice small in the vast space. "The farmhands," Cathwolf corrected smoothly, though her eyes flickered. "There are rules here, girl. Listen closely, because I will not repeat them. You do your work. You keep your head down. You do not speak unless spoken to. And most importantly," she pointed a bony finger toward a heavy set of double doors at the far end of the hall, "you never, under any circumstances, enter the West Wing. That is Mr. Thorne's private sanctuary. If you are found there, I cannot help you. Do you understand?" "I understand," Otsana whispered. "Good. Take your bag to the servants' quarters behind the kitchen. Change into the uniform you find on the bed. Then come back and scrub this floor. It has footprints." Otsana did as she was told. The uniform was a simple gray dress, functional and dull. She returned to the foyer with a bucket of soapy water and a brush, dropping to her knees to scrub away the mud her own shoes had left. The rhythm of the work was grounding. Scrub, rinse, repeat. It was something she understood, unlike the menacing forest or the silent, hulking men she had glimpsed outside. She was halfway across the obsidian floor, her back aching, when the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The air grew heavy, charged with static electricity that made the hair on her arms stand up. The front door opened again. It didn't creak this time. It was thrown open with force. A man walked in. No, not a man. A storm in human shape. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that strained the fabric of his dark flannel shirt. He brought the smell of the forest in with him. Pine needles, damp earth, and raw, metallic power. His hair was dark and windblown, falling over eyes that were shadowed and intense. He moved with a prowling, silent grace that defied his size, his heavy boots making no sound on the stone. Otsana froze, clutching the scrub brush like a weapon. This had to be him. Mr. Thorne. He didn't look at her. He was stripping off leather gloves, tossing them onto a side table with careless aggression. "Cathwolf!" His voice boomed, a deep baritone that vibrated in Otsana's chest. "Where is the report from the northern perimeter? I smelled intruders near the ridge." He strode toward the staircase, his path taking him directly past where Otsana was kneeling. She tried to make herself small, curling inward, praying he wouldn't notice her. She was just a piece of furniture, a debt payment scrubbing his floor. But as he passed her, he stopped. It wasn't a gradual halt. He froze mid-step, his entire body going rigid as if he had hit an invisible wall. The silence that followed was absolute. Otsana stopped breathing. She stared at his boots, muddy and large, inches from her knees. Slowly, terrifyingly, he turned his head. Hrolf didn't want to look. He wanted to keep walking, to get to his study and pour a drink strong enough to drown the feral edge of his wolf that had been agitated all day. But the scent hit him like a physical blow, a fragrance of rainwater, soft vanilla, and something uniquely, devastatingly sweet. It cut through the smell of mud and blood, hooking directly into the primitive part of his brainstem. Mate. The word roared in his mind, alien and undeniable. He looked down. The girl was small, painfully thin, kneeling in a puddle of soapy water. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with terror, her pulse fluttering in her throat like a trapped bird. She was human, fragile, breakable. And she was the one thing the universe had decided belonged to him. A growl ripped its way out of his chest before he could stop it. A low, vibrating rumble that was entirely animal. His vision swam, the gold in his irises bleeding into the pupils. The urge to grab her, to pull her off the floor and bury his face in her neck to claim her, was so violent it made his hands shake. Otsana gasped, scrambling backward on her hands and heels, the water sloshing over her uniform. She saw his eyes shift, saw the predatory hunger that twisted his handsome face into something monstrous. He looked like he was going to tear her throat out. "Mr. Thorne?" she squeaked, terrified. The sound of her voice snapped the trance, or perhaps it horrified him. Hrolf recoiled as if she had burned him. He looked at his own hands, claws threatening to burst through the skin, and then looked back at her with a mixture of longing and absolute panic. A human mate was a death sentence. For her, for his pack, for his sanity. "Stay away from me," he snarled, the words distorted by teeth that were lengthening. He didn't walk away. He fled. He spun around and stormed toward the forbidden west wing, the heavy double doors slamming behind him with a force that shook the chandelier and left Otsana alone in the center of the wet floor, trembling in the wake of a monster she was bound to by a fate she couldn't see. The heavy double doors of the west wing shuddered in their frames, the echo of Hrolf's exit vibrating through the floorboards like the aftershock of a quake. Inside the sanctuary of his study, Hrolf didn't stop moving. He prowled the length of the room, a caged animal in a suit of human skin, his claws lengthening and retracting in a painful rhythm that tore at his fingertips. He grabbed a crystal decanter of whiskey from the sidebar and didn't bother with a glass. He downed a third of the amber liquid in one burning gulp, praying it would dull the screaming instinct in his blood. Mine. Mate. Claim. "You smell like a forest fire, Hrolf." The voice was cool, detached, and irritatingly calm. Hrolf spun around, his lip curling back to reveal teeth that were too sharp to be human. Zed Romulus, his beta, stood by the fireplace, leaning against the mantel with crossed arms. Zed was the ice to Hrolf's fire. Calculated, political, and ruthless in his logic. "Get out!" Hrolf snarled, the sound scraping against his vocal cords. "I can't do that," Zed replied, unmoving. "Not when you've just sprinted through the house because a scullery maid looked at you." "I smelled her too, Hrolf. It's faint, buried under the scent of cheap soap and fear. But it's there. She's the one. Isn't she?" Hrolf slammed the decanter down, the glass cracking. "She is human, Zed. She is fragile. If I touch her, I will break her. If the pack finds out their alpha is fated to a human, they will see it as a weakness," Zed finished, pushing off the mantle. "The elders are already restless. Fawil Tiama is circling. You cannot keep her here. Send her back to the city. Pay the debt, break the contract, and let her go." "I can't," Hrolf roared, the human facade slipping. "The bond is already set. If she leaves the territory, I will lose my mind. I will hunt her down. It is biology, Zed, not choice." Zed's expression hardened. "Then bury it. Keep her in the kitchen. Keep her out of sight. Because if you let that girl think she is anything more than a debt payment, you will start a war you cannot win." The house was a cage of silence and shadows. For 3 days, Otsana tried to make herself invisible. She scrubbed floors until her hands were raw, polished silver until she could see the terror in her own reflection, and avoided the west wing as if it were a gaping maw. But invisibility was difficult when the very air of the house seemed to be watching her. The kitchen was her only refuge, largely thanks to Ulva. Ulva was a whirlwind of teenage energy in a house of statues, a girl of about 17 with wild, curly hair and an appetite that defied physics. "You're peeling them too slow," Ulva chirped, snatching a potato from Otsana's hands and flaying it with a knife speed that blurred the air. "Cook gets mad if the mash isn't ready by 6. The boys get grumpy when they're hungry." "The boys?" Otsana asked, reaching for another potato. "The security team, the groundskeepers, the pack. The staff," Ulva corrected quickly, biting her lip. She grabbed a strip of raw beef sitting on the counter, destined for the stew, and popped it into her mouth, chewing happily. Otsana stared. "You shouldn't eat raw meat, Ulva. You'll get sick." Ulva laughed, a bright, barking sound. "I have an iron stomach. Besides, everyone here likes their meat rare, especially the Alpha. Mr. Thorne." She froze, her eyes widening. "I talk too much. Cathwolf says my tongue is going to get me in trouble one day." "Why does everyone call him that?" Otsana lowered her voice. "Mr. Thorne acts like he hates me. He looked at me once and ran away." Ulva stopped chewing. Her playful expression vanished, replaced by a somber intensity that looked too old for her face. "He doesn't hate you, Otsana. He's just dangerous. To himself. To us. You should be careful. Being noticed in this house isn't always a gift." Otsana learned the truth of Ulva's warning the next afternoon. She was in the rose garden, pruning the deadheads off bushes that had thorns the size of shark teeth, when a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see a woman standing on the stone path. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with pale blonde hair that fell like liquid silk and eyes the color of Arctic ice. But there was nothing soft about her. She wore high-end athletic gear that hugged a body made of lean muscle and violence. This was Fa'Wiltiama. Otsana had seen her from a distance, ordering the groundskeepers around with a snap of her fingers. "You're the stray," Fa'Wiltiama said. Her voice wasn't a question. It was an accusation. She stepped closer, invading Otsana's personal space. She didn't smell like perfume. She smelled like ozone and something metallic. "I'm the new housekeeper, ma'am," Otsana said, clutching the shears. Fa'Wiltiama leaned in, inhaling deeply near Otsana's neck. Her lip curled in a sneer of disgust. "You smell like dishwater, and underneath that—" She paused, her eyes narrowing into slits. "Underneath that, you smell like him." Otsana stepped back, confused. "I don't know who—" "Don't play dumb, human," Fa'Wiltiama hissed, her hand shooting out to grab Otsana's wrist. Her grip was like a steel vice, painful and unyielding. "Hrolf reeks of you. His scent is clinging to your skin like a disease. I don't know what game you're playing, or what kind of witchcraft you used to catch his attention, but hear me now. You are nothing. You are a fleeting moment. I have been by his side for a decade. Do not think you can walk in here with your doe eyes and take what belongs to the strong." She shoved Otsana back, hard. Otsana stumbled, dropping the shears, her heart hammering against her ribs. Fa'Wiltiama loomed over her, her eyes flashing a momentary, terrifying shade of amber. "Stay in the scullery, rat. If I catch you near the Alpha again, I won't just warn you. I'll break you." That night, sleep was impossible. The bruise on Otsana's wrist throbbed, a reminder that the danger in this house wasn't just in her head. But it wasn't the pain that kept her awake. It was the sound. A mournful, melodic howling drifted through her open window. It started low, a rumble in the earth, and rose to a crescendo that made the glass in the panes rattle. It wasn't a dog, and it wasn't a coyote. It was something ancient. It called to a part of her she didn't know existed, a tug in her chest that felt like a hook pulling her toward the source. Against every survival instinct she possessed, Otsana got out of bed. She pulled a shawl over her nightgown and crept barefoot down the back stairs, slipping out the kitchen door into the cool night air. The moon was full, bathing the estate in a spectral silver light. She followed the sound to the edge of the forest, where the manicured lawn met the wild tree line. And there, standing atop a moss-covered boulder, was the beast. It was massive, easily the size of a small horse. Its fur was midnight black, absorbing the moonlight, rippling over muscles that bunched with raw power. It threw its head back and let out another cry, a sound of such profound loneliness that it brought tears to Otsana's eyes. As the howl faded, the wolf lowered its head. It turned. Golden eyes, luminous and intelligent, locked onto hers. Otsana should have run. She should have screamed. But her feet were rooted to the earth. The wolf jumped down from the rock, landing with a heavy, silent grace. It padded toward her, lips pulled back not in a snarl, but in a strange, panting curiosity. It stopped inches from her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from its massive body. She reached out, her hand trembling. The wolf didn't snap. It leaned into her touch, pressing its massive, wet nose against her palm. A spark of electricity, hot and familiar, jolted through her arm. "Mr. Thorne?" she whispered into the dark. The wolf stiffened. A twig snapped nearby, and the spell broke. The beast pulled away, looking at her one last time with an expression of profound sorrow, before turning and vanishing into the shadows of the trees. The next morning, the library was a tomb of tension. Otsana had been summoned. She stood before the massive oak desk, wringing her hands, waiting. Hrolf stood by the window, staring out at the grounds. He looked exhausted. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his hair messy, dark circles bruising the skin under his eyes. He didn't turn around when he spoke. "You were outside last night," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel grinding together. "You were told to stay inside." "I heard something," Otsana stammered. "I saw—" "You saw a wolf," Hrolf turned then, his gaze pinning her to the spot. The intensity in his eyes was the same as the beast's, gold, burning, inescapable. "A monster." "I didn't see a monster," Otsana said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I saw you." Hrolf crossed the room in 2 long strides, slamming his hands onto the desk, looming over her. "Do you have any idea what you are saying? Do you understand where you are?" "I know this isn't a farm," Otsana said, backing up until her legs hit a leather armchair. "I know the men are too strong. I know Ulva eats raw meat. I know you growled at me." "We are Lycans," Hrolf spat the words out, a confession that sounded like a curse. He stepped around the desk, cornering her. "We are predators, Otsana. We are not men who shift into wolves. We are wolves who wear the skin of men. And you are a human, a prey animal. You are in a den of killers." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, trembling with the effort to not touch her. "Every instinct I have tells me to claim you, to mark you, to keep you. And if I do that, my pack will tear you apart because they will see you as the thing that makes me weak." Otsana looked up at him, seeing the war raging behind his eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you need to be afraid," Hrolf whispered, his voice breaking. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, a contact that sent fire racing through her veins. "You need to be terrified, Otsana, because I can't let you go. I tried. God help me, I tried. But now that you know, now that you've seen the wolf and didn't run, I can never let you leave." The peace of the estate was a lie A thin veneer of silence stretched tight over a drumhead of violence. For a week after Hrolf's confession in the library, Otsana moved through the house like a ghost, the knowledge of what surrounded her humming in her blood. She knew she should be terrified. She was a gazelle living in a den of lions. But fear had been replaced by a strange, magnetic gravity. She found herself watching the tree line, not for escape, but for him. It was a Tuesday, the air crisp and smelling of incoming snow when the illusion shattered. Otsana was in the rear courtyard, pinning heavy linen sheets to the drying line. The domesticity of the task felt grounding. The snap of the wet fabric in the wind, the smell of lavender soap, the bite of the cold on her fingers. It was normal. Then the sirens screamed. It wasn't a digital wail. It was a horn. Deep and guttural, blasting from the perimeter towers. Birds erupted from the trees in a panicked cloud. Before Otsana could drop the clothespins, the hedgerow exploded. A creature burst onto the manicured lawn. It was a wolf, but wrong. Its fur was patchy and matted with mud, its ribs heaving, foam dripping from jaws that snapped at the air in a rabid frenzy. It was a rogue, a wolf lost to madness, driven by a sickness of the soul. It locked eyes with Otsana. It didn't see a person. It saw meat. Otsana froze, her breath catching in her throat. The beast charged, claws tearing up the earth. She scrambled back, tripping over the laundry basket, tumbling onto the stone pavers. The rogue launched itself into the air, a missile of teeth and death. She threw her arms up, bracing for the tear of flesh. A roar shook the ground. Louder than the siren, a blur of midnight black collided with the rogue in midair. Hrolf. He hit the intruder with the force of a freight train, the impact sickeningly loud. They rolled across the grass, a tangle of limbs and fur. Hrolf didn't just fight, he executed. With a savagery that turned Otsana's stomach, he pinned the rogue and silenced it with a single, brutal snap of his jaws. Silence crashed back down on the courtyard. The white sheets on the line were splattered with red. Hrolf stood over the carcass, his massive wolf chest heaving like a bellows. He was covered in gore, his golden eyes wild and dilated. He looked entirely monstrous. Slowly, he turned his head toward Otsana. He flinched, expecting her screams. He expected her to look at him with the same horror the rest of the world held for his kind. He backed away, a low whine building in his throat, shame battling the adrenaline. Otsana didn't scream. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her legs moved on their own. She stood up, her hands shaking, and walked toward him. "Hrolf," she whispered. The wolf growled, a warning to stay back, to save herself from him, but she ignored it. She reached out, grabbing a clean towel from the basket as she passed. She stopped inches from his muzzle. The metallic scent of blood was overwhelming, but underneath it was pine and rain, the scent of the man who had saved her. She reached out and pressed the towel to his snout, gently wiping away the blood of the intruder. "You're hurt," she said softly, ignoring the carnage to focus on a small nick on his ear. The wolf froze. The wildness in his eyes shattered, replaced by a look of devastating vulnerability. He leaned into her palm, a massive, deadly predator submitting to the touch of a human hand. The air shimmered around him, a heat haze of magic and biology, and with a sound like cracking bones, the wolf shifted. Hrolf stood before her, naked and unashamed, his skin slick with sweat and blood. He didn't cover himself. He grabbed her face between his large, rough hands, checking her for injuries with a frantic intensity. "Did he touch you?" he demanded, his voice a jagged ruin. "Did he hurt you?" "No," Otsana breathed, looking up into his face. "You saved me." "I am a killer, Otsana." he rasped, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. "This is what I am. Violence. Blood." "I know," she said. And for the first time, she didn't pull away. She stepped closer, pressing her hand against his chest, feeling the thunderous beat of his heart. "I'm not afraid of you, Hrolf. I'm afraid of a world without you." Hrolf let out a sound that was half sob, half growl. He pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her hair, inhaling her scent as if it were oxygen. "I cannot keep you in the servants' quarters. It is not safe. If the rogues know you are here, if they know you are mine, then where do I go?" "You come with me," he said, pulling back to look at her with fierce possessiveness. "To the Alpha suite, where I can hear your heartbeat while I sleep." The move was swift and caused a seismic shift in the house. Cathwolf pursed her lips but said nothing as Otsana's meager belongings were transferred to the sprawling, luxurious suite in the West Wing. But silence was not acceptance. That evening, the atmosphere in the estate was suffocating. Hrolf had summoned the council. The great mahogany doors of the meeting room were thrown open, and Otsana sat at the long table, Hrolf standing behind her chair like a sentinel. Across from them sat the elders, led by Magnus Voss. Voss was an ancient wolf, his skin like parchment, his eyes hard as flint. Next to him sat Zede, looking grim, and Fawil Tiama, who was vibrating with suppressed rage. "This is madness, Hrolf," Voss said, his voice dusty and sharp. "You bring a human into the inner circle? You house her in the Alpha's bed? You violate centuries of law." "She is my mate," Hrolf said, his voice low and dangerous. "The bond is absolute. You know the laws of nature supersede the laws of the pack." "A human mate is a weakness," Fawil Tiama shouted, slamming her hand on the table. "Look at her. She has no claws. She cannot shift. She cannot heal. If a rival pack attacks, she is a liability. She will get you killed." "She is under my protection," Hrolf snarled, his eyes flashing gold. The lights in the room flickered. "Anyone who speaks against her speaks against me. Anyone who threatens her challenges my authority as Alpha." He placed a heavy hand on Otsana's shoulder. It was a claim, a brand. Voss leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "We cannot force you to reject her, Alpha. But know this. The Shadowclaw pack is moving on our borders. They smell blood in the water. They hear rumors that the Wolf King of Lycan Park has gone soft for a human pet. By keeping her here, you do not just endanger yourself. You endanger us all." Otsana felt the weight of the stares, the judgment, the hatred, the fear. She reached up and covered Hrolf's hand with her own, squeezing tight. She had crossed the threshold. She was no longer just the girl sold for a debt. She was the target on the Alpha's back, and the storm was just beginning. The threat of war didn't look like fire and brimstone. It looked like exhaustion. For 3 days following the council meeting, the estate was locked down. The windows were shuttered, the perimeter patrols doubled, and the air in the hallways grew heavy with the scent of anxious testosterone. Hrolf was rarely in the Alpha suite. He spent his hours in the war room with Zede and Skull, staring at maps, his face growing gaunter, his temper shorter. Otsana watched it all from the periphery, feeling the weight of her own existence pressing down on the pack. She was the crack in the foundation, the flaw that the enemy was waiting to exploit. Miles away, in the industrial decay of the city's edge, that enemy was already moving. Alpha Conry sat in the back of a repurposed meatpacking plant, the air thick with the copper tang of old blood and rust. He was a wire-thin man with eyes that looked like holes burned in a sheet of paper. He listened as his spy, a low-ranking Omega who had defected from Hrolf's territory, spilled the secrets of Lycan Park. "It's true then," Conry mused, cleaning his fingernails with a serrated knife. "The great wolf has taken a pet." "She lives in his rooms, Alpha," the spy stammered, eager to please. "The pack is divided. The elders are furious. They say Hrolf is distracted, weak." Conry smiled, a stretching of skin that looked painful. "Distraction is all we need. Hrolf is a fortress. You cannot batter down his walls, but you can get him to open the gate if you hold the right key." He stood up, tossing the knife onto the metal table. "Prepare the extraction team. We don't need to fight the pack. We just need to pluck the flower." Back at the estate, the poison was spreading from within. Otsana was in the library trying to distract herself with a book she couldn't focus on, when the door clicked shut. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "He looks tired, doesn't he?" Fawil Tiama asked softly. Otsana turned. The blonde wolf was leaning against a bookshelf, looking immaculate and cruel. "He is working hard to protect the pack," Otsana replied, keeping her voice steady. "He is working hard to protect you," Fawil Tiama corrected, pushing off the shelf to stalk closer. "Do not mistake the two. Before you came, Hrolf was untouchable. Now, he is second-guessing his commanders. He is keeping his best warriors close to the house instead of the borders. He is terrified, Otsana, and a terrified Alpha makes mistakes." Fawil Tiama stopped inches from her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Conry is coming. He is a butcher. When he attacks, he won't just kill Hrolf. He will torture him. He will make Hrolf watch as he tears this estate apart, and it will be your fault. You are the anchor dragging him to the bottom of the sea. If you truly loved him, you wouldn't force him to choose between his heart and his survival." The words were a precision strike, landing exactly where Otsana was weakest. Fawil Tiama didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked out, leaving the silence to do the rest of the work. That night, Hrolf returned to the suite late. He didn't turn on the lights. He simply collapsed onto the bed, still fully clothed, burying his face in the pillow. Otsana lay beside him, listening to the ragged rhythm of his breathing. He smelled of stress and stale coffee, the vibrant forest scent of him dulled by fatigue. She reached out to touch his hair, and he leaned into her hand unconsciously, murmuring her name in his sleep. It broke her heart. Fawil Tiama was right. As long as she was here, he was vulnerable. He would burn the world down to keep her safe, even if he had to stand in the fire himself. Otsana made her choice. She waited until his breathing deepened into the heavy rhythm of deep sleep. Slowly, agonizingly, she slipped out from under the duvet. She didn't pack a bag. That would look suspicious. She put on her jeans, her coat, and her sturdy boots. She wrote no note. Words would only give him a trail to follow. She crept through the darkened house, using the service corridors she had scrubbed just weeks ago. She knew the shift changes of the guards. She knew that Jace, the youngest sentry, dozed off at the delivery gate between 3 was and 3:15 a.m. She slipped past him, a shadow within a shadow, and stepped out into the cold night air. The forest was silent, the moon hidden behind a bank of thick clouds. Otsana walked fast, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot. She just needed to get to the main road, to catch a trucker or a bus, to get far enough away that Hrolf would stop looking. She told herself she was saving him. She told herself this was the only way. She reached the edge of the territory, where the ancient pines gave way to the scrubby brush of the public lands. She paused, looking back one last time at the distant lights of the estate, tears blurring her vision. "Goodbye, my wolf," she whispered. She turned to step across the boundary line, and the shadows detached themselves from the trees. She didn't hear them coming. One moment she was alone. The next, a heavy hand clamped over her mouth, stifling her scream. A cloth soaked in something sweet and chemical was pressed against her nose. Otsana thrashed, kicking out, her nails clawing at the arm that held her, but it was like fighting stone. "Got her!" A rough voice growled in her ear. The world began to spin. The trees elongated, twisting into nightmare shapes. Her legs gave out. As the darkness rushed up to meet her, the last thing she felt was the crushing regret that she hadn't stayed to fight, and the terrifying realization that by trying to save Hrolf, she had just handed his enemy the weapon that would destroy him. Hrolf didn't wake up because of a sound. He woke up because his soul felt like it had been ripped in half. He sat bolt upright in the dark, his chest heaving, his hand automatically reaching for the warmth that should have been beside him. His fingers met only cold, crisp linen. The scent of vanilla and rain was fading, replaced by the sterile emptiness of the room. He didn't need to turn on the light to know she was gone. He didn't need to find a note to know she hadn't been taken from the bed by force. There was no smell of intruders in the suite. She had left him. But then the bond screamed. It wasn't a thought. It was a physical blow. A spike of pure, unadulterated terror slammed into his mind, traveling down the invisible tether that connected him to his mate. It wasn't his fear. It was hers, and it was mixed with the sickening, coppery scent of distress that hit his nose even from miles away. Hrolf didn't bother with the door. He roared, a sound of such primal devastation that it shattered the windows of the Alpha suite. He shifted mid-air as he vaulted off the balcony, landing on the frost-covered lawn as a massive black wolf, his claws tearing deep gouges into the earth. The howl he released tore the night apart. It wasn't a call to hunt. It was a declaration of war. Lights flickered on throughout the estate. Doors burst open. Zeed, Skull, and the elite enforcers poured out of the barracks, shifting as they ran. Their human forms melting into fur and muscle. They didn't need orders. They could taste the Alpha's rage in the air. It tasted like ozone and blood. They fell in behind him, a tide of shadow moving through the trees, heading unerringly toward the industrial rot at the edge of the city where the Shadow Claw Pack made its den. The abandoned meatpacking plant smelled of old death and rust. Inside the main kill floor, Otsana was on her knees, her hands zip-tied behind her back. Her cheek was throbbing where she had been struck, and the chemical taste of the chloroform still coated her tongue. Alpha Conry paced in front of her, dragging the tip of a long, rusted machete across the concrete floor. Sparks flew, illuminating the ring of his wolves who stood in the shadows, leering. "He's coming," Conry said, his voice giddy with anticipation. He grabbed a handful of Otsana's hair, yanking her head back to expose her throat. "I can feel him. He's burning up the road to get to you. Predictable. He'll kill you." Otsana spat, though her voice shook. Conry laughed. "He'll try. But Hrolf has a fatal flaw. He's honorable, and he loves his pets." The metal doors of the loading bay exploded inward. They didn't just open. They were torn from their hinges, crumpling like tin foil. Hrolf stood in the opening, back in his human form, naked and terrifying. He was covered in a sheen of sweat, his chest rising and falling with the force of his fury. Behind him, Zeed and Skull flanked the entrance, their wolf forms bristling, growling low in their throats. Hrolf's eyes locked onto Otsana. For a second, the murderous rage faltered, replaced by a desperate relief that nearly brought him to his knees. "Let her go," Hrolf said. The command vibrated the metal catwalks above them. "Welcome, King of the Park," Conry sneered, pressing the cold steel of the machete against Otsana's jugular. A thin line of red bloomed on her white skin. Hrolf took a step forward, and Conry pressed harder. Ah! Another step, and I open her up like a letter. Hrolf froze. The most powerful alpha in the territory, a man who could tear a bear apart with his bare hands, stood paralyzed. "Kneel," Conry commanded. "Don't!" Otsana screamed, struggling against her bonds. "Hrolf, don't do it! Kill him!" "Silence, bitch!" Conry backhanded her without looking, keeping his eyes on Hrolf. "I said kneel, submit to me, surrender your territory, and I might let you carry her corpse home." Hrolf looked at the blood trickling down Otsana's neck. The conflict in his eyes was agonizing, the alpha who could not bow, fighting the mate who could not let her die. Slowly, with a sound of grinding teeth that echoed in the silent hall, Hrolf dropped to his knees. He lowered his head, exposing his neck. A gasp went through the room, from Conry's men, and from Zeed in the doorway. The king had fallen. Conry threw his head back and laughed, a triumphant, howling sound. "Look at him! The great Hrolf Gonzalo, brought low by a piece of human trash." He stepped away from Otsana, raising the machete high, intent on delivering a humiliating, non-fatal strike to Hrolf's shoulder to mark his victory. He forgot about the girl. Otsana saw the blade rise. She saw Hrolf's eyes close, accepting the blow for her. The guilt that had been drowning her since she left the estate evaporated, replaced by a cold, white-hot clarity. She wasn't a damsel. She was the mate of a predator, and she had lived in a den of wolves long enough to learn how they fought. Her hands were tied, but her legs were free. As Conry shifted his weight to swing, Otsana coiled her muscles and launched herself upward. She didn't try to run. She threw her body weight violently against a rusted metal tray table next to her, sending a collection of old butcher's tools clattering to the floor. Conry flinched at the noise, distracted for a split second. That second was all she needed. Otsana dropped to the floor, her fingers scrabbling blindly behind her back until they closed around the cold handle of a boning knife. She screamed, a raw sound of fury, and thrust her bound hands upward, driving the knife blindly into the meat of Conry's thigh. Conry shrieked, the machete clattering from his hand as he stumbled back, clutching his leg. "Hrolf!" Otsana yelled. Hrolf's eyes snapped open. He didn't need to be told twice. He didn't shift. He didn't have time. He launched himself from his knees with the explosive power of a coiled spring. He hit Conry before the other alpha could recover, tackling him to the concrete. The fight was brutal and short. There was no artistry, no duel. It was an execution. Hrolf rained blows down on Conry, his human fists doing the work of hammers, before he finally let the wolf take over. His jaw unhinged, teeth lengthening, and he ripped Conry's throat out in a spray of crimson. The Shadowclaw wolves surged forward, but Zeed and Skoll were already there, leading the Lycan Park forces into the fray. But the fight ended as quickly as it began. Seeing their leader dead on the floor, the rival pack threw down their weapons, baring their necks in submission. Silence fell over the slaughterhouse, heavy and thick. Hrolf stood up, chest heaving, blood painting his chest and face. He didn't look at the defeated enemies. He turned slowly to Otsana. She was still on her knees, the zip tie cutting into her wrists, the bloody boning knife lying on the floor behind her. She was bruised, bleeding and shaking, but her chin was held high. She met his gaze and she didn't look away. Zeed stepped forward, his wolf form shifting back into a man. He looked at Conry's body, then at the knife on the floor, and finally at Otsana. The disgust that had lived in his eyes for weeks was gone, replaced by something that looked dangerously like awe. Hrolf crossed the distance in a second. He ripped the zip ties apart as if they were paper. He didn't care about the blood on her or him. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him so hard she gasped. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of her life, shaking with the aftershocks of his terror. "You fought," he whispered into her hair, sounding bewildered. "You didn't run." "I'm done running," Otsana sobbed, clutching his bloody shoulders. "I'm yours, Hrolf. I'm yours." Hrolf pulled back, cupping her face, smearing blood on her cheek like war paint. He looked at his pack, at Zeed, at Skoll, at the warriors who were watching them. "Let them see," Hrolf growled, his voice carrying to the rafters. "Let them see the Luna who saved their Alpha." For the first time, no one looked away. No one whispered. In the gory cathedral of the slaughterhouse, surrounded by death, Otsana had finally earned her life. The return to Lycan Park was a silent procession. The convoy of black SUVs wound its way up the mountain road, the tires humming against the asphalt in a lullaby that couldn't quite drown out the adrenaline still singing in Otsana's blood. She sat in the back of the lead vehicle, wrapped in Hrolf's heavy coat, which smelled of his sweat, his blood, and the deep, earthy scent of pine that was finally beginning to smell like safety. Hrolf sat beside her, his hand gripping her knee with a force that turned his knuckles white, as if he were terrified that loosening his hold would cause her to vanish into smoke. When the iron gates groaned open, the estate was not asleep. Every light in the manor was blazing, casting long, golden beams across the frost-covered lawn. The entire pack had gathered. They stood in silent rows along the driveway. Staff, warriors, elders, and children. News of the Alpha's victory, and the human who had forged it, had traveled faster than the cars. Hrolf helped her out of the car. Otsana hesitated, her boots hitting the gravel. She was bruised. Her hair was matted, and she wore the dried blood of a rival Alpha on her skin. She felt unworthy of the grandeur of the house, but Hrolf didn't give her time to doubt. He wrapped an arm around her waist and walked her toward the steps, his head held high, challenging anyone to look away. They didn't. Zeed Romulus stood at the base of the stairs. The beta looked weary, his clothes torn from the fight, a bandage wrapped around his forearm. Next to him stood Elder Magnus Voss, leaning heavily on his cane, his expression unreadable. Fauil Tiama was nowhere to be seen. Her absence spoke louder than any exile order. Hrolf stopped a few feet from his second-in-command. The air was thick with tension, the pack waiting to see how the hierarchy would settle after the chaos. Zeed looked at Hrolf, then slowly shifted his gaze to Otsana. He looked at the zip-tie burns on her wrists and the fierce set of her jaw. Slowly, deliberately, Zeed dropped to one knee. He didn't bow to Hrolf. He bowed to her. He tilted his head to the side, baring the vulnerable column of his throat, the ultimate sign of submission and trust in wolf culture. "I said you would make us weak," Zeed said, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp night air. "I was wrong. You have the heart of a wolf, Otsana. You have the heart of a queen." One by one, the others followed. Skoll, the warriors, the kitchen staff, even Elder Voss, with a stiff, reluctant nod, bent the knee. Otsana looked out over the sea of bowed heads, her breath catching in her throat. She wasn't being accepted as a guest or a pet. She was being acknowledged as Luna. 2 days later, in the grimy district of the city where the story began, the final loose end was tied. Farkas Lobo sat in his kitchen, pouring a celebratory drink. The silence in the apartment was blissful. No niece nagging him about bills, no debt collectors banging on the door. He had done it. He had cleared the slate. He raised the glass to his lips, a smile tugging at his mouth. The lights went out. Farkas froze. The air in the room changed, growing heavy and cold. He heard the front door click shut, though he hadn't heard it open. A shadow detached itself from the corner of the room, a figure so large it blocked out the dim light from the street lamp outside. Gamma Skull stepped into the sliver of light. He was in human form, but his eyes were glowing a predatory amber, and his teeth looked too sharp when he smiled. Who are you?" Farkas stammered, the glass slipping from his fingers and shattering on the floor. "I don't have any money. The debt is paid. Ask Hemming. Ask Mr. Thorne." "Mr. Thorne is occupied," Skull rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. He picked up a chair with one hand and tossed it aside as if it were made of balsa wood. "He is preparing for a wedding, but the Luna, she has a soft heart. She worries about family." Farkas scrambled back until he hit the counter. "Otsana, is she okay?" "Is she working hard?" "She is ruling," Skull corrected. He stepped closer, looming over the small, trembling man. "She is the mate of the Alpha, which makes her royalty, and royalty cannot have liabilities." Skull reached into his jacket and pulled out a single, heavy envelope. He dropped it onto the table. It wasn't money. It was a one-way bus ticket to a state on the other side of the country, and a warning written on Lycan Park stationery. "You sold a queen for pocket change, little man," Skull whispered, leaning down until Farkas could smell the violence on him. "If you are ever seen in this city again, if you ever speak her name, if you ever look in the direction of the mountains, I will find you, and I will not be as polite as I am tonight." Farkas didn't pack a bag. He ran, and he never looked back. The full moon rose a week later, a perfect pearl suspended in a velvet sky. The estate was transformed. The scent of winter jasmine and ceremonial fires filled the air. Tonight, there were no walls between the pack and the wild. Otsana stood in the center of the ancient stone circle deep in the forest, wearing a simple slip of white silk that shimmered in the moonlight. Her bruises had faded, healed by the strange, symbiotic magic of the bond she now shared with Hrolf. She felt a hum in her veins, a connection to the earth, to the trees, and to the 100 souls watching from the shadows of the grove. Hrolf stepped into the circle. He was naked to the waist, his skin painted with symbols of ash and ochre, marks of protection, fertility, and eternal binding. He looked at her with a reverence that made her knees weak. He didn't see a debt payment. He didn't see a human. He saw his other half. "Do you accept this life?" Hrolf asked, his voice rough with emotion. "It is not a safe life, Otsana. It is teeth and claws and blood. It is forever." Otsana stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She placed her hand over his heart, feeling the thunderous rhythm that beat for her. "I was sold to a monster," she whispered, a smile touching her lips. "But I found a king. I accept the teeth. I accept the claws. I accept you." Hrolf lowered his head. He brushed his lips against the sensitive skin where her neck met her shoulder. "Then reign with me." He bit down. It wasn't pain. It was a rush of pure energy, a golden fire that flooded her system, binding her soul to his with a knot that death itself couldn't untie. Otsana gasped, clutching his shoulders as her senses exploded. She could smell the snow on the peaks miles away. She could hear the heartbeats of the pack in the woods. She could feel the fierce, overwhelming love of the wolf inside him. She wasn't just human anymore. She was pack. Hrolf pulled back, licking the mark on her neck to seal it. He turned her to face the crowd, his arm wrapped around her like a band of steel. He threw his head back and let out a howl, a sound of triumph, of joy, of completion. And the pack answered. 100 voices rose in the night, a chorus of wolves singing to their moon and their new mother. Otsana leaned her head against Hrolf's chest, watching the moon climb higher. She thought of the diner, of the grease, of the fear that had defined her life for so long. That girl was gone, burned away in the fires of the slaughterhouse. In her place stood Luna Otsana of Lycan Park. She had been sold for a debt, but she had claimed a destiny that was priceless.